Well, I just before I turn on the screen here, I just want to say thanks. I really have actually appreciated these interactions with the previous cohort, and I think in some of the related conversations with people who represent I think some of the sectors and the spaces in which you are kind of existing and professionally, but also in kind of your personal life, of where those things kind of bleed and blur into one another. It's really great to be with you for a little while. So I do have some slides and things that I'm going to show, kind of walk through some stuff. But I think tonight really is designed for, as much as it's been described to me, kind of the cafe kind of conversation. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I'm kind of banking on that. So be prepared. So let me get this started here. And so the first thing that I want to mention is just everybody likes to say this, or I guess especially academics really like to think in these ways, that they're doing the thing that is really relevant and kind of timely for that moment. It's a pretty hard, I feel like I could win some kind of discussion or debate about the timeliness and appropriateness of civil discourse, and kind of where we are as a country, but also kind of globally. And I'll talk a little bit about that in just a bit. But the sense of the necessity, kind of what it is, making some sense of it, frankly, why it matters, and a sense of also where we go from here, is how I want to frame this tonight. And with that said, there are two things that have shifted since whatever kind of notes. So I actually over the summer was tenured and promoted. So I'm associate professor now, and we had a faculty member and who was the director of our Center for Engagement and Community Development, but also our Institute for Civic Discourse and Democracy here at K-State, David Proctor, who some of you may know through your work in various kind of spaces. He stepped down over the summer. So for the last 5 years, I've been the assistant director with him for the Institute, but this summer kind of assuming that director position. So it's been really exciting to think about what that means, especially in the context right now. Our Institute is actually the hub here at K-State for voter registration and engagement. So the second half of that title has been really prominent, especially this fall. But what shapes so much of how I think about this work is really that first half, right? This civil discourse piece. And then the other thing that might be worth just mentioning here briefly is that actually prior to even coming here to K-State, I've had an affiliation and kind of an appointment with the National Institute for Civil Discourse at the University of Arizona, which if you're not familiar with that, you may find some of that interesting to take a look at. It was founded after Representative Gabby Giffords was shot in her Congress on the Corner meeting in 2011, and it has continued to try to foster conversations across the aisle in Congress and state legislatures. Kansas is actually a really phenomenal example of legislators across the aisle in both houses trying to work in these ways. So I note that because I wear kind of multiple hats, but I really want to speak primarily kind of wearing the K-State hat, and then as it kind of bleeds into, I think, the bigger conversations that shape so much of what's actually happening here. So tonight, I want to talk about some of these obstacles and these challenges, and frankly, these opportunities of what I like to call living well with one another. And so central to this kind of sense of shared life is the sense that we frankly need to be able to engage one another in kind of civil public discussion about what we call kind of complex or wicked problems, things that aren't necessarily solvable in a technical way, although that can be a part of our response to it, but it really invites us and frankly encourages us to engage in those ways. So we need to, I would argue, frankly, do better, right? And this is an old image. I wish there was a cleaner version of it, right? But what do we want, right? We want some respectful discourse, but like we got to figure that out together. And as I said a moment ago, when we often think about something like politics, and it's a word that I use all the time, especially when I'm teaching, I teach undergraduate and graduate students regularly, is I talk a lot about politics. And the first image you might have looks something like what you're seeing here, right? The voting, the ballot, the idea of kind of this happening in a place like in Congress, for example. But I really want you to be thinking about politics happening in ways that are embodied in the images that you're seeing here as well. The small groups that are gathered around tables, these are examples of diverse groups of folks wrestling with challenges using a variety of processes, some of which I'll talk a little bit about later tonight, but really opportunities for them to use dialogue and deliberation as a way to think about facts and values, ideally kind of landing in this kind of intentional way to foster more robust and frankly not stepping away from the issues or the tensions or even kind of the partisan views, for example, but finding ways to actually navigate in a positive way through that. So a little bit about, and the last thing, this is the last thing kind of about the work that I'm doing, but it's framed so much of how I think about this work. So for the last, from 2017 to 2019, I was part of multiple projects. And so these are the 4 book projects that I was co-editor on. But they all intersect with these themes of dialogue and deliberation and education, right? What does it mean for us to think about learning as a way and a critical element for, frankly, democracy to be continued and kind of fostered, whether we're talking about classrooms, with youth, or in higher education, all the way to, frankly, what we're doing tonight. The opportunities for people to be engaging ideas and concepts, not necessarily in some sense of uniformity about agreement about what it is per se, but truly stepping into some of the spaces where we can learn with and from one another. So let me give a little bit of context and some background for these things that I want to talk about. And as I said at the very beginning of my remarks, is that for a lot of people, this feels like just so important and necessary, and maybe it's never been worse than this. And I want to remind all of us that we have a history that's rich and complex. And as you see here from 1856, even in Congress, this is an image from Representative Preston Brooks from South Carolina, who was attacking a senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, who was an abolitionist, with his walking cane in retaliation for a speech he gave 2 days prior, where he was fiercely attacking slaveholders, including a relative of Brooks, right? So and this is a classic image that gets kind of used in some of these kind of conversations, but I think it's important that we've found ways to work through issues. Civil war is not something I aspire to, and I mean, frankly, without joking here, the conversations that many are having around how do we step back from kind of the intensity at this moment, I think highlights the real concern of potential violence and others, but I think we can and should find ways that are kind of alternatives to that, and I think it's very, very much a possibility. So this is not the kind of the peak of where we've been, kind of in a bad way, but we're really challenged, which is what I want to talk about here for just a second, right? So civility, or the lack thereof, across the board is a stated problem. There's an annual survey done by Weber Chandwick, and it's called Civility in America. This is from a couple years ago. And you can see on the left side, right under that title, the partisan agreement on the state of civility, that 93% of people say civility is, that we have as a country a problem with civility. 69% say this is a major problem, and just about another quarter of people say this is a minor problem. And what you see across party, and as we were beginning this evening, there was a little bit of a conversation in using some of the partisan language and framing, is that this is a shared reality across the board. And that's, I think, an important thing to note. And it's only been heightened in some really significant ways more recently. In 2017, another study, actually this one by the American Psychological Association, looks across generations. So from those older adults through baby boomers, Gen X, and then millennials, not necessarily younger than that, which is an important thing to note. Not so much that it is the worst or the lowest point in our history, but it's what they are recalling as the lowest point in their memory. And so for us to think about people who have lived through some really significant moments, as you can see along the bottom there, that we have a majority of people saying that this is the lowest point in our history, is a very serious thing to consider and think about, because it has ramifications in a global sense as well. And a project that I'm actually a part of called the Varieties of Democracy is the world's largest data set actually on democracy for the last 120 years of every country. I would encourage you to take a look at it. vdim.net is where you can find all of it. But a couple years ago in their annual report, they kind of made this startling finding and noted it, right? That for the first time, that we had this troubling statistic, right? This number of countries that were kind of stepping away from democratic practices were equal to those that were advancing. For a lot of our recent history, we've seen much more kind of the democratization of countries. And as this report notes, 2.5 billion people were living in places that were experiencing these trends more towards kind of autocratic, kind of authoritarian models of modern life. The most recent report, which came out earlier this year, only kind of reinforces some of these themes. The numbers have ticked up, so instead of 2.5, it's 2.6. The EU, for example, has its first non-democracy member, Hungary, and for a number of other countries experiencing what's being referred to kind of as this third wave. It's not a small thing to note that the experiences and some of the trends that we're seeing and feeling, reading about, maybe even observing kind of firsthand in this country are happening in lots of other places. And I'm not, this is going to be the last kind of set of statistics that I want to throw at you, but it's also an important one. It might be actually, frankly, be easier to see as you're on your own screens tonight. But in 2017, there was a study looking at people from across the globe, particularly Western democratic countries. So Great Britain, Netherlands, New Zealand, Australia kind of fall into that Western democracy category, Sweden and the United States. If you look at those bottom decades of birth, from 1930 to 1980, you can see those trends going down. And so the sense of younger people, for example, saying that they could live in a country that was not necessarily democratic, but if it still afforded them a certain set of opportunities and privileges and rights, that would be okay. That's a very alarming kind of statistic, right? So you can see for the United States, for example, being more than 70% down to about 30% there on the far right is really important. I want to talk a little bit here for just a moment about some history, though. Earlier this year, this fantastic article actually about a lot of the things that I study. If you've ever, for those who are in the KARL conversations, you'll recognize somewhere this intersects. In the 1930s, as Jill Lepore kind of writes, was the last time democracy kind of almost died. And the way that they, at that time, responded to it, I think affords us an opportunity to think about what we do today. So very famously in 1931, Arnold Toynbee kind of says this, right? That people all over the world are seriously contemplating and frankly discussing the possibilities that the Western system of society might break down and cease to work. Right? So there was this broader public discussion taking place about how to best address and respond challenges that were economic and social and political, really raising very explicit concerns from a lot of people that democracy's future was being challenged. So why was this a concern in the United States at that time? Well, we have examples from 1934 to 1940 of these very undemocratic practices within our own country, right? So Nazi youth, for example, the German-American Bund doing these kind of flag raisings, for example, in New Jersey, a rally for Americanism conducted by the KKK and the German-American Bund, also in New Jersey in 1940. And then that bottom image on the right, a crowd saluting, again, the German-American Bund parade, and this time in Long Island in 37. Highlighted by a couple of years ago, a very powerful 7-minute documentary called A Night in the Garden. In 1939, 22,000 people packed into Madison Square Garden. And the following day, the New York Times ran these headlines, right? That the kind of intertwining of these ideals of what American democracy meant and should be was being altered and shaped in a way that was really challenging to this idea of democratic practice, the kind of pluralistic society that we aspire to, that we're challenged to have then, and frankly are still challenged to have now. But it was very real and very much something that was going on. But the flip of this is that at the same time, this article from the New York Times by John Studebaker of the Studebaker Forums in Des Moines, published in 1937, something called the Beacon Lights of Democracy. These moments in which, as you can see from a number of communities, and in fact, Wichita was one of these communities that was involved in this work, the idea of having people convene regularly, and the Studebaker forums were really designed around utilizing school buildings in the evenings where people could come and listen to lectures. They could have conversation with one another around a whole host of issues, because Studebaker, as the Commissioner for Education at that time, really saw education as being an essential element of the future of democracy. And particularly in rural communities, and this is where a lot of my work has been focused, my research for the last 15 years, has been on the intersection of the USDA and the extension system and other organizations like the Farm Bureau and the like, the Farmers Union, where they were creating opportunities for, as M.L. Wilson, who was an administrator of the USDA at the time, said, that we really need to think about the farmer as a citizen, right? That they need opportunities to kind of talk through things and understand them. So I want to actually highlight here George Gimmel, who was here at K-State at that time and helping to cultivate these conversations in communities all across the state. In fact, probably in some of the places where you're from in the 1930s and into the 1940s, but saying that they could dedicate someone full-time in every state to work with and through extension to vote to this idea of training leaders. And so when I'm speaking with you tonight, I'm hearing kind of George Gimmel's voice in the background here of the attempts that are happening through some of the work that you're doing of engaging people in significant conversations and, frankly, dialogue around what needs to be done to improve your communities and your neighborhoods. This is what these meetings look like. And they would meet in front rooms and in halls, Grange halls, talking about all sorts of issues. They'd create these resources that you can see a few of the images on the left. I'll make it a little bit bigger to where you can see some of these titles. They talk about things like the future of rural communities. What do they need? They talk about environmental issues such as soil conservation, issues like taxes and farm finance, international trade. The issues that we wrestle with today in many ways were the same issues that they were dealing with. And so when I said at the beginning here of the wicked problems that don't necessarily get resolved, they get addressed in some way, but then it becomes kind of a new manifestation of that. That's really in many ways kind of where we are today, that we're not the first ones to be wrestling with or dealing with some of these issues, but we're finding, for me, it's helpful to see these deep roots and recognize that we have long struggled with some of these questions. These are some of the discussion materials that were utilized at that time. And if anybody's ever interested in looking at these, I have a number of these, the full documents that would be kind of interesting. But they were talking about things like agricultural policy and the ways that they were playing into the conservation of the soil, thinking about the Dust Bowl at that moment. Here's another one. The image on the right, I absolutely love. You can see that discussion leader at the top, but it also would include the farmer who raises crops and the woman who runs her own farm, again, thinking about the time, the significance of that, the people who lived in town, the president of the local farm organization, right, the spouse, the farmer's wife who's part of the PTO. The idea of bringing the wide kind of breadth of a community together in these structured discussions was really important, what they were trying to do, because they saw, again, education as an essential part of the future of democracy. And they trained people in this process. So it wasn't simply showing up and talking about something, but at the heart of it was really this idea of preparing people to be leaders of these kinds of discussions, right? So they would walk them through very literally to make sure that they had well-ventilated areas and that they had lights, that people could learn folks' names and had a blackboard and chalk, right? So when we think about flip charts and things today, this was their version of this. Starting on time and actually closing on time, so I want to be sensitive to that tonight as I'm talking. But this idea in that image on the right side of the document is the sense of like even how to have as best as possible interactions and conversation that would maybe quell a little bit those who say on that fourth point, right, interrupting the speech maker as tactfully as possible, finding ways for others to have voice and some agency in these discussions. And as one of the 1942 document captured so beautifully in some of these captions, right, the sense of these conversations spilling out over cups of coffee, or when people are in the hallways, or when they're going home, were so significant for them. So I realize that was kind of quick and fast here on some of the history, but I think it's really important and significant for us, because the moment that we're in is not the first time we've been here, nor sadly, and maybe frankly, is it the last, but there are ways that we can navigate in more constructive ways. So I want to define a couple terms here real fast for us that might be helpful. Civility is a term that you're probably familiar with, and you might have a sense of what that means. From the book, A Crisis of Civility, that one of those books that I was the co-editor of that we published last year, there's a chapter in there by a philosopher who talks about civility in these two ways. One is civility as politeness, right? So those kind of codes of conduct, the thank yous, the kind of formal ways in which we are able to have conversation is really best thought about that way. And that's not something we should diminish. It helps us. It kind of it gives the kind of lubrication for the conversation to occur. But the second sense of the civility as responsiveness is the one that I want to spend a little bit of time on here for a moment, because it highlights the importance for us to be able to engage, especially when that, as that third point kind of notes, right? When we can disagree without being disagreeable, right? The alternative to that is that we can agree to disagree, or perhaps more appropriately think about disagreement as a reason not to stop talking. The idea that we have to have the ability to work through the challenges that we face, not so much to just let it be and you walk away and the other person kind of goes the other direction, but for us to stay in some sustained way, maybe in that moment or in a longer term kind of interaction with one another. The centrality of civility as this responsiveness that was really grounded in this sense of duty, right? This expectation of and concern and care for others around us. So civility is this big picture way of thinking about this, and then the ways that it shows up can be manifest in a variety of forms. So debate, you're probably familiar with, maybe you even did it in your high school days or even college. The things that I'm going to talk a lot about, and I hope that we can discuss a little bit later, are much more in the kind of dialogue and deliberation spaces. And so deliberation, importantly, at the very bottom of this, highlights this sense of truly that, think about that scale, right? How do we balance and weigh considerations? What are the tensions and trade-offs that are present in our lives that we really want to think about, especially as serving kind of practical purposes that allow us to have that kind of civil discourse. And the other kind of related piece here is that I really want us to be thinking about engaging as what a number of people, and I write about this too, but as civic professionals, right? That for those of you who are in professional fields, or even if you're not, right, the sense of expertise, whether it's local or technical, the idea of being a professional is you've got some of that, but there's also this social aspect, right? What is it that shapes the work that we do, this larger kind of public end at the heart of it? And as Al Dazer says, it's about being kind of democratic professionals, not because we're doing democracy professionally, but because we're doing professionalism really democratically. So this orientation to our approach to the work that we do, whether it's in our formal positions during kind of the day, or if it's in more of our kind of citizen hat at night, it's really rooted in this idea of engaging people through that kind of dialogue and deliberation that helps us actually have that civil discourse that we may kind of attempt to have. What are the factors that shape so much of this, though? Bill Bishop has a very famous book called The Big Sort. And I might invite you here for just a moment to think about your own communities, where you live, maybe even depending on the context, down to your neighborhoods. What does it look like? Is there a dominant political, cultural, religious identity? Or are you part of that? Or maybe in some way, are you not? Bishop's work looked at literally kind of the census data and found that people were moving into kind of communities where they were aligned ideologically and kind of these reinforcing notions of a lot of what we would think about now, especially on social media, like kind of the bubbles that would kind of reinforce our ways of seeing the world. I want to show you two images from Bishop's book, though. One is from 1976, and the other is from 2004. What's important here is to see the white counties. Those were the the counties that were competitive, regardless of the party. And the parties don't really matter at this moment so much. But I'm going to show you these two things kind of like your eye doctor. 1976 and 2004. I'm going to show you them again. So what you see, one, you see a lot of gray. But the other thing is we see a lot less white, right? So the competitive counties largely kind of vanish, again, when we look at these contrasts. And this would actually only be further reinforced. Unfortunately, Bishop's never updated this book, so it's now a little bit dated and we don't have the more recent data. But the fact of, and we know it from other sources, the fact that we live in a world where increasingly, if you're not part of that dominant culture, you might be one of the few, if not the only person kind of standing out. And depending on the spaces in which you exist, this can be a real challenge and an obstacle to engaging others, especially if you feel like your voice doesn't have some level of legitimacy or agency kind of in the spaces where you are. This harkens back, though, I think, to a really important point, back to the earliest decades, literally, of our country's founding. And Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s was traveling around the country, and he was fascinated. He was a Frenchman, and he was fascinated by what was going on in these colonies and these early states, right? This kind of rootedness in the townships. And he would talk about this kind of associational life, right? Where people independently could only do so much, right? They could hardly do anything themselves, as he said at the bottom of this quote. But it was really in this sense of volunteering and engaging with one another that they were able to do a lot of the important work that was necessary at that time. And we see that still today. And one of the challenges, as Robert Putnam has noted famously in a book called Bowling Alone, that we've lost some of that sense of that kind of township life. He largely studied from the middle of the 20th century on that people were no longer joining these kind of social or recreational clubs, right? So the bowling clubs, the bowling leagues that they might have been part of, the Elks and the Moose and the other various lodges that you might be a part of, that was being diminished. Others, such as Mark Dunkelman and Timothy Carney, writing both from the political left and also from the right, have noted these same trends, right? This sense of kind of the vanishing relationships from those most immediately around us in both urban, suburban, and rural contexts. So, and Robert Nisbet's The Quest for Community really spoke a lot about this in the middle of the 20th century, this kind of dissolution of civil society and the sense that people were connected with one another. So across the ideological spectrum, we have a lot of sources that highlight part of what exacerbates our problems right now around civil discourse and the ability to speak with one another, frankly, is that we are not interacting and engaging in the ways that would be really significant and robust. And the last one that maybe highlights some of this is a great book. I love the title, Why the Garden Club Couldn't Save Youngstown. Was looking at Allentown, Pennsylvania and Youngstown, Ohio, two very similar places, industrial backgrounds. I'm originally from Ohio, so I actually know both of these places fairly well. And what Sean Shaffer found was the social networks, the connections that people had in the economic arenas, in the political, as well as the various others that would kind of fit into this bigger category of kind of civic leaders, that defined and shaped what would happen to these places. The one that had these strong networks of people interacting and engaging with one another found a new way of being. The other tried to long for a past. Allentown's the one that makes it, and Youngstown is the one that doesn't, because they tried to double down on kind of who they were in the middle of the 20th century to maybe nobody's surprise, the fact that that became just more of a rust belt rather than kind of a revitalized and reimagined place. All of this is to say that when we think about our communities, there are a number of challenges, but there are a number of actors that come into play. David Matthews, the president of the Kettering Foundation, talks about this as the ecology of democracy, right? So we can think about, and I'm going to show you a different image that might help it be a little bit more clear. You know, what are the institutions that help make possible some of this work? So there's the informal interactions, right? But there are also the businesses and the government and the arts, the nonprofits. the faith communities, for example, and the schools that all help to cultivate the opportunities to where we can literally sometimes meet physically in spaces, although we're not doing much of that right now, but also this sense of relationship, of cultivating that ecology. And as David Matthews, kind of writes about it from the kind of swamplands where he's from in Alabama, when they got rid of all the natural barriers for hurricanes, they realized they had really destroyed a whole ecosystem. And so I really want us to think about this question of discourse happening within a context of our own ecologies. What do those look like? The one thing I don't mention on this slide is media. And for all sorts of reasons, media is really complicated, and I don't want to go too far down this path. But a fascinating study that just is fairly recent found that in places around the country, major regional newspapers, including the Wichita Eagle, the Denver Post, the San Jose Mercury News, they shed 80 to 90% of their reporting and editorial staffs. And so from 2008 to 2017, newsroom employment dropped 23%, right? With some implications. 2,000 media jobs were lost, for example, within that window. And a study about the closure of newspapers highlights, I think, the importance, and this is from the end of 2018, what we kind of are confronted with. When we lose some of those local papers, it actually, in a statistically significant way, has people become more polarized. Because what they do is turn to national media, which is designed literally and unfortunately to kind of satiate your desire for the thing to reinforce your probably predetermined view. So those who are leaning left or leaning to the right can pre-select. Local media largely can have a slant, but not as significantly as the national papers. And so what we find is that the split ticket voters at local levels decreases almost 2% when we actually lose that source of local information, because that's partly how we get to know one another. In addition to those, the gas stations, when we're standing around getting a cup of coffee, or the little diners, or reading in the paper about what's going on, in addition to the local sports team, that sense of life with one another becomes really important. So what do we do? And this is going to be kind of where I wrap up. A big part of what shapes the work that I do here at Kansas State in our Institute for Civic Discourse and Democracy is rooted in work called Dialogue and Deliberation, and the streams of engagement that I show here represent the breadth of this kind of work happening in a variety of spaces, from exploratory kind of conversations at the beginning of, we have a problem, but we don't know exactly what it is, all the way to this sense where we want to have some kind of collaborative action with one another. And so I want to just talk about these for literally just a moment to give a little bit of context to each of these. So this idea of exploration is really grounded in something like World Cafe, right? It's a very easy process, and I'm going to throw a couple examples out here just so you can realize the breadth of this. World Cafe is something that doesn't even require facilitators. It allows people to kind of listen and imagine with one another. There's a creative element that you're kind of drawing on big pieces of paper with one another, but it's designed to allow people to have the preliminary conversations about the issues that really matter to them. So it's a super easy, kind of simple process. I'm happy to share resources with you after the fact. You can also do a quick search online and find World Cafe and the process that goes into it. But this idea of exploration is, for many people, often where conversations really need to start. We need to have those first interactions around some shared issue. Another area that we might want to think about is conflict, right? So the idea of poor relations between individuals, or more in our context, groups. So the idea of sustained dialogue, the importance of us having kind of the interactions with one another in a sustained way, is embodied in something like restorative justice, right? How do we not just simply approach an issue that's going on in some punitive way, but in addition say, what might allow us to address the issue at hand, what's also about safety and accountability, but also helps us to learn from what's going on, that provides an alternative. And restorative justice is being used a lot with youth and in kind of marriage counseling situations, but also in community settings as well, which is why I mentioned it here as well. Decision-making is something that you can use some processes such as the National Issues Forums when you really want to think about a policy. So those old 1930 discussion guides actually kind of fall into this category of creating resources that don't skew one way with bias, provide kind of the background information, but allow you to have kind of the informed discussion with one another that's really critical. An example of this is National Issues Forums. Here's a discussion guide on the issue of immigration, right? So it's not simply left or right politically, but it's looking at multiple options, and within each of these, actions and also drawbacks. So these tensions and drawbacks about each of these possible kind of paths you might choose to pursue highlights the reality that all of these issues are much more complex, and we would really benefit from having the opportunity to have these kind of conversations with one another, rather than simply falling into more of a debate kind of argumentative approach and say, this is right, this is wrong, and I'm going to try to win this and convince you to my position. From all the research, especially kind of psychological research, is that only exacerbates the problem and rarely does anything in a positive way. So finally, collaborative action really gets us to this place when we say, what are these problems and what do we actually do about them? Here in Manhattan, for example, we used something called study circles, one of these examples that's mentioned here, around the issue of housing. So this is from our local library from last year, where we convened people over a few months, people who are landlords, renters, homeowners, local businesses, to talk about the issue of housing in our community and what does that mean. So all of these different examples really provide an opportunity for thinking about civil discourse in practice, right? So the context and the examples that we might want to think about, or that you might be thinking about, of like, oh, you know, we're dealing with an issue. If you're in Western Kansas, for example, it might be around water. Some of the issues and concerns might really be coming up as it relates to police-community relations right now. Something you may not thought about a lot, but might want to consider as a topic for discussion. Well, what does that mean? What are you even trying to do? These streams of engagement, I think, really present an opportunity for thinking about it in categories that could be really helpful. And maybe the very last thing I'll say here is our own institute. We have these principles of civic discourse. And for any public meeting, and actually for a lot of classes, I will use these, especially when we're going to have maybe more contentious topics being discussed. And this is not obviously an exhaustive list, but it does capture a lot of the issues of places where, when it's possible, how do we find places of common ground? Also inherently expecting that we're going to have different viewpoints, and that's okay. In fact, that's good, I would argue. Everybody needs opportunities to speak, so thinking about what that actually means. How do you construct or kind of create the space for that to be possible, to where you're not just having one or two voices shape what's happening, but also importantly, that listening is happening, that it's not simply just giving people the chance to say something into the air, but in fact that it's being received and kind of wrestled with, maybe internally, but also in conversation. Something we added a few years ago with this idea of supporting claims. So it's not simply walking in with a fact sheet. That might be the case in some instances, but it's also grounded in the idea of thinking about especially local knowledge and experience that shapes so much of how we might want to think about the work that we do. And you know, the last couple here are talking about the communication differences we have. Some people, especially on the topics, if we're in, say, in Dodge, for example, and we're talking about issues of immigration, what does it mean when we have potentially the exclusion of a whole segment of the population because of language barriers? How do we attend to that or address it? Maybe it might be a larger challenge than is possible to deal with, especially if you don't have resources or infrastructure, but at least engaging those questions becomes a really important thing to do. And then finally, staying on point and respecting time, which I've done a slightly poor job of tonight, but in my defense, there was a lot of things I really wanted to say, and I hope that some of this could kind of whet a bit of an appetite for some conversation and discussion. So what I really see now is less of a Q&A and more of really a conversation that hopefully I can be responsive to some of the things that I was presenting on, but also I'm really just looking forward to being in conversation with you all. So I'm going to, if you want any of that, I'm happy to throw this back up at the end, but I'm very happy to speak with you tonight. But if there's also another reason at some other point to be connecting on any of these things, I'm very happy to do so. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing here, and I'm looking forward to some conversation tonight. So thanks.